everybody. I know most of you, but I will say who I am anyway, in case you've forgotten. My name is Kelly Greenlee. I am the Outreach Librarian here at Edgewood Library. And welcome to another installment of our Lawns Gone Wild series. It's been a really successful and interesting series, largely due to Aaron Parker, who is with us again today. He gives great informative talks, and I'm so glad you're here to hear a little bit about seed saving today. Coming up in the Lawns Gone Wild series, I of course did not bring my little handy dandy cheat sheet at the back of the room. Have it. Thank you. Okay, coming up on Thursday, September 28th, we have Defending the Dark. I'm really excited about this. This is a film screening about light pollution. I think I'm excited about it because light pollution is one of my pet peeves. So it's a personal thing with me, but that's going to take place at the Recreation Center at Valhalla. And we're going to watch a 35-minute documentary film. And then there's going to be a Q&A with astronomers from the Southern Maine Astronomy Group. And then one of the astronomers is going to, if the skies are clear, that's a big if, he'll take us outside and give us a laser tour of some constellations in the sky. So that's the 28th of September at 6:30 p.m. And then later on in October, we've got seed sowing with the Wild Seed Project. They're going to teach us the basics of sowing native seeds. And we're going to be able to, it's going to be hands-on. So everybody's going to plant 2 pots of, when is it? There are sheets over there, but Saturday, October 28th at 10 a.m. And that's going to be at the Cumberland Community Orchard site, which I'm going to let Jesse tell you a little smidge about, surprise, momentarily. Anyway, people are going to be able to plant 2 pots of seeds, native seeds, and take 1 pot home and leave 1 pot at the orchard to be planted at the orchard. So that's really exciting. And then later on in January, thinking way ahead here, on January 13th, Jesse is going to teach us about some of the best tools to have for your garden and how to use them, more importantly. Things like broad forks, scuffle hose, rakes, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what we have ahead in the Lawns Gone Wild series. Jesse is a part of the sustainability committee for the town of Cumberland. They received a grant, which has made all of these programs possible, the Lawns Gone Wild series possible. So we're happy to partner with them and with the Chebeagan Cumberland Land Trust to offer the series. Jesse?
Great. I'm Jesse Lamar Vincent. I'm on the Sustainability Committee for the town of Cumberland, as part of the Lands and Conservation Commission. Like I said, we got a grant to do some sustainable and resilient landscaping education. So all these talks we've been able to get Aaron to come and do. And another part of that is we're starting a hands-on community orchard at the end of Stiles Way, sort of in the land around the brush dump and salt shed, where there's already a beautiful peony and butterfly garden. So basically where that peony and butterfly garden is, it's just gonna start extending out backwards. So if anybody wants to be involved, we're gonna plant, I don't know, 100 trees maybe next spring, and then hopefully continue planting stuff until the whole area that's now just a field will be a beautiful orchard where our kids and grandkids can pick fruit and nuts for generations to come. And so we're so excited that Aaron's here to talk about seed saving. Aaron runs Edgewood Nursery, and I've learned a ton from him visiting his nursery and getting plants and listening to his talks. And so I'm excited to learn more about seed saving. I do a lot of it and don't know what I'm doing. So sometimes the seeds I save don't germinate. I'm hoping to learn what I'm doing wrong. But sometimes they do, and I share them with friends, which is exciting. So without further ado, I'll let Aaron take it away and blow our minds about how to save seeds.
All right, hopefully you haven't set the bar too high. So my name's Aaron Parker, and I have been saving seeds for about 20 years. And that started off with just a couple varieties, and now I save seeds of, I don't know, probably over 100, and that makes up maybe a quarter to maybe a third of my seeds, both as retail packets to wholesaling to Fedco and experimental farming. So there's a lot of nuance to seed saving, and I'm going to try and delicately walk the line between doing something that's strictly like intro 101 level and also giving you enough depth to have something to kind of grow on. So yeah, let's get into it. I've got a presentation that I'm going to try to keep to about an hour. And then after that, I'll do a outdoor hands-on seed cleaning demo. Just to, that stuff is really better if you can see it and touch it and see what's going on with that. If you don't have time to stay for that, at the very bottom of the handout, there's a link to a podcast version of this talk, and that page also has videos on it that more or less cover the seed cleaning demo. If you didn't get a handout, there are paper ones at the back. You can also scan this or scan the code in the back to get a digital version. You could take the digital one instead of the paper one, or you could get both. The digital one's handy, just has clickable links on it. All right, so a lot of seed saving is kind of knowing some stuff about plants and how they grow. I'm using my slides. There we go. But first, we'll talk for just a second about why you might want to save seeds. And there's lots of reasons. More control over what you grow. So you can not only grow varieties that aren't commercially available if you're able to save seeds, but you can also influence how those varieties are maintained and shift how they're maintained. There are more cultivars available. Oftentimes you can get a tiny amount of seed one time for like some rare variety that's not available commercially. And if you want to grow that variety more than once, you got to go with the same ground seeds. That ties into the preservation of rare cultivars. The genetic heritage of agriculture is being pushed through a huge bottleneck. We've lost about 90% of our agricultural genetic diversity in the past 50 years. And that's a real big problem, especially because if you haven't noticed, the climate is changing really, really rapidly. And if we want to be able to continue to have all the different kinds of food that agriculture provides us with, we're going to need to adapt those crops to climate change. And in order to have successful adaptation to climate change, you need as broad a genetic pool to work with as possible. So now is not a great time to throw away 90% of the plant breeding work that our ancestors did. Economics, it takes not very much time and effort often to save seeds, and then you don't have to buy those seeds again. That ties into food security. If you are growing your own food, it helps to be able to save your own seeds, and that way you don't have to worry about, oh, will my favorite variety go off the market, or will there be a shortage, or blah, blah, blah. If you got it and you can maintain it, then an active resistance. Like I said, we're losing our genetic diversity in agriculture at an astonishing rate, and most of that is due to, rather than having a small patchwork of small companies and cooperatives and individuals growing our seeds, the entire market is getting gobbled up by massive international corporate conglomerates. They would love to just own all of the seed industry, and luckily they haven't quite managed that yet. But the more people can save seeds on their own or in the community, then the more we can kind of stave off that duopoly of Monsanto and Syngenta. You have more connection to your plants. Lots of people grow carrots, but don't realize what carrots look like in bloom, because you grow them for one season and you pick them and eat them. But when you are saving seeds, you, by necessity, get to see the entire life cycle of the plant. So you get to see that, carrot root turn into a plant this tall, covered in beautiful flowers. You can breed your own varieties when you save seed. I think this is one of the most interesting and fun aspects of seed saving. And it also ties back into that climate change thing. By having varieties of plants that are actively changing on the landscape, they are sort of by default being bred for climate change adaptation. And then we'll also talk a little bit more about this later. Land races. Land races are types of, they're varieties of plants that are very loosely defined. So you're probably all familiar with what a certain variety of kale looks like. And land races are like gene pools that are not super specific. And those are probably going to be very useful to us in the future as we go from seasons like we had 2 years ago, which was the worst drought in recent memory, to years like this, where it seems like it rains every single day, and I haven't watered in like months outside of the house. So having crop plants that have enough genetic diversity in one variety to thrive both in a drought year and in a year like this is going to be a smart move moving forward. All right, so back to some terminology. Hopefully everyone's familiar with some of these things, so we can kind of speed through this. But annuals are plants that grow from seed, bloom, and die in a single season. And you kind of need to know what the life cycle of the plants you're growing is, so that you know when they're going to produce seed and what kind of maintenance they need in order to do that. So broccoli, lettuce, peas, most beans, squash, watermelons, all common annual crops. Biennials are plants that grow from a seed, produce leaves and roots in year 1, and in year 2 produces seeds and then dies. A lot of your root vegetables like carrots, beets, onions, those are all biennial. Cabbage, parsley, and some ornamentals like hollyhocks and sweet william are all biennials. Perennials are plants that live for 3 or more years. There are 2 types: herbaceous perennials that fat back to the base in winter, at least in our temperate climate, and woody plants that grow permanent stems, trees, shrubs, and some vines. Here's some herbaceous perennials. All right, now we get into some of the more seed-saving specific jargon. Open pollinated, and you often see this called OP, stands for pollinated, heirloom, or stable breeding. So these terms describe a variety that comes true, which means that if you take the seed that a plant produces, you're going to get a plant that looks similar. So take black turtle bean, put it in the ground, it's going to grow a new plant that will also grow black turtle beans. If you take the seed out of a small red cherry tomato that is open pollinated or stable breeding, plant it, you're going to get a plant that produces more small red cherry tomatoes. Pretty straightforward. This is achieved by several generations of selection. Hybrids, F1. These are a first generation cross of 2 stable breeding varieties. So when you get hybrid seeds from the seed catalogs, and these are increasingly common since the 1940s and 50s, they've taken over a large share of the market for most species, not so much for beans, say, but hybrids are very common. And they have very, very good vigor usually, something called hybrid vigor. And they have very good uniformity, meaning all the plants are basically exactly the same, which is great for industrial farming because you could have a 100-acre field and it's all planted on the same day and it all ripens on the same day. Run a machine through it, pick it very easily. Not so great for climate change adaptation, not so great for home gardeners, because it's actually kind of nice to have plants ripening over a series of weeks, because it's not great for you to have like all your lettuce ready at once, because you can eat so much of it. So hybrids, you know, they have good and bad characteristics, but they're kind of annoying for seed savers because they typically don't come true very well. And if you remember Mendelian genetics from high school, this is why. We're not going to get into that totally because it would take too much time, but it is very interesting. And if you want a refresher on Mendelian genetics, I recommend Wikipedia. But the gist of it is in, you know, if you have a green pea and a yellow pea, and the genetics or the genes that cause green peas are recessive in the F1 generation, you're going to get all the yellow peas. And then if you take those F1 yellow peas and grow them out, again, what you're going to get is this sort of scatter plot of all the different possibilities. To put another way, you take that F1 red cherry tomato, plant it, and you'll get a good amount of red cherry tomatoes, but you'll also get some yellow ones, and you'll get some that are big, and you'll get some that are small, and you'll get some that are light resistant, and you'll get some that are not. You get the scatter plot of all options. And if you have a hybrid variety that you would like to start saving seeds of, you can grow them out and just save the seeds from the ones you like and not save the seeds from the other ones. And you can do something called dehybridization. So you can create a new stable breeding variety out of F1 hybrids. And that new variety can either closely resemble the original hybrid or not. You might find that you really like the big prune peas and just select those, and you can make that into the stable breeding variety. All right, more terminology. We have species, crop, landrace, variety, and clonal cultivar. And I like to represent these as sort of a series of nested boxes. So all of the crops in one species will be the same species, and all of the clonal varieties are of like apples, say, are also going to be the same crop in the same species. And I like to use broccoli as an example. So Calabrese broccoli is a pretty common variety, and it's broccoli, so it's a heading version of Brassica oleracea. But there's many crops within that one species. So broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, collard greens, and kohlrabi and cauliflower are all one species. And it's important to know this for seed saving because all of those will cross. So if you plant cabbage and a Brussels sprouts and they're blooming at the same time, they'll cross, and both of those plants will produce seed, and they both will have like an intermediate or a mix of characteristics. And a pretty common broccoli or Brussels sprout cabbage cross is like a stem of Brussels sprouts with a cabbage head on top, which sounds cool. Like, you know, these crosses aren't necessarily bad, but if you want just more cabbage seed, then you got to make sure that there aren't other grasses blooming at the same time. Any questions on that? I got some questions.
Is it blooming at the same time, or is there a distance between those crops that we can maintain that would prevent that?
Yes, excellent. We will definitely talk about isolation. And yes, there's several different ways to prevent this. More plant physiology stuff. Monoecious plants have separate flowers on the same plant for male and female, like this corn. The tassel of the corn is the male flower. It produces pollen that blows in the wind. The silk of the corn is the female flower. It receives that pollen. So every thread of corn silk is a long tube that leads to each kernel of corn. And in order for that kernel to fill, a single grain of pollen needs to land on that thread. And this is why if you plant one row of corn, you're going to get like a weird scatter shot of corn that doesn't totally fill, because you should plant it in a block so that you get pollen blowing around and filling that up. Squash flowers are male and female. You can tell the female one because it's got this ovary here that looks like a mini version of the squash. The male flower just has a little stem. Dioecious plants have separate male and female plants. It's most common in woody plants, but you also see it in some annuals like spinach. Obviously, if you want seeds, you need both male and female plants. Self-pollinating plants. These plants don't need pollen from another source. They mostly just take pollen from the same flower to itself. And that doesn't mean that they don't need pollinators. Sometimes like beans don't necessarily need pollinators. They need peas, but tomatoes really do, just to move the pollen that quarter of an inch. But these are very easy to save seeds from. And if you're gonna, if you feel at all intimidated by saving seeds, I recommend starting with like 1 or 2 species of self-pollinating plants, but they're super easy. Outcrossers. These plants are typically pollinated by a separate plant and are easily crossed with any variety in the same species. Many outcrossers have some mechanism to prevent the plant from pollinating itself, such as shedding pollen and accepting pollen at different times, or self-incompatibility, where the pollen from the plant's own flowers cannot be accepted. So this is an example that would be like an apple tree. If you have just one isolated apple tree, you probably won't get almost any fruit. There's plenty of apple pollen there, plenty of pollinators. The pollen just kind of doesn't work. It needs pollen from a genetically distinct individual. If you want to grow more than one variety in the same species, so you want to save seed from kale and broccoli in the same year, you need to have some way to isolate them. And there's many ways to do this. By time, and the easiest way to do it by time is just growing one variety per species in a year. But you can also go within the same year by kind of, well, in the example of kale and broccoli in our season tends to bloom really late and kale blooms really early. So as long as they're not blooming at the same time, it's fine to grow them in the same year. You might even be able to push that a little bit, like say you have 2 varieties of carrots and that are, you grew last year, they're stored in the root cellar. Maybe one variety goes into the hoop house or comes out of cold storage really, really early. And the other variety you hold back in the root cellar for as long as you can. And that might give you just enough time for one to bloom and stop blooming before the next one starts. Also by distance, a lot of seed-saving reference material will say you need to isolate by a quarter of a mile or something. And that might be ideal, but sometimes doing the best you can is plenty. So if you've got a big yard, even just planting 2 different varieties at opposite ends is probably enough, especially if there's a lot of flower diversity in between those 2 ends. It's probably enough to get decent isolation. This is probably not a great idea if you're like the last person saving some super rare variety. You know, the rarer the material you're working with, the more careful you want to be. So maybe if you've got 2 super rare varieties that you really need to grow out, maybe you grow one at your house and grow one at a friend's house. But for sort of general seed saving, kind of isolating by distance the best you can is generally fine. You can also use barriers, like row cover, screen cages, hoop houses, to isolate 2 varieties from each other. The issue with using barriers is almost all plants still need pollinators to get in there. And you can either introduce pollinators, but that's kind of a pain in the butt and more like an advanced thing. Or you can do something called alternate day caging, where you've got 2 beds, and on day 1, you put the cage on that, you know, on bed A to prevent pollinators getting in there, and bed B gets pollinated, and then the next day you switch. And you can do that in rotation, several different beds, if you were very ambitious. Any questions on this? Because this is one of the most tricky and technical bits of seed saving. It's just like when you want to grow more than one thing of the same species, how are you going to make sure they don't cross? And it's, you know, this is as basically as far as it gets, so it's not bad. All right, population sizes. Again, if you look in reference books, it'll tell you like, make sure you have at least 50 individuals in your gene pool. And that's great if you can pull that off. But I absolutely encourage people to, you know, grow as many individuals as you can when you're saving seeds, but don't let that be a barrier to you. If you have, you know, only enough room to have 5 of some plant growing seed, that's much better than not saving seeds at all. And the reason for wanting large populations when you're saving seeds is to preserve as much of the possible gene pool of that plant, and to prevent something called inbreeding depression. And inbreeding depression is where the gene pool narrows to the point where you get reduced vigor. So if you start out with plants that are, you know, big and healthy and do great every year, and you're just saving seed from like 1 or 2 individuals every year, after a few years, mutations and recessive genes can pile up to a point where those plants are no longer very vigorous. So having several different genetically distinct individuals blooming at the same time is important. And much more important to have large populations with outcrossers than self-pollinating plants, because those self-pollinating plants are just taking the pollen from themselves anyway. And again, like you want to pay more attention to these best practices of having big populations and having large isolation distances if you're preserving something that's particularly rare. If it's something that you can just go and buy more of at the hardware store if anything goes wrong, you know, it matters a lot less. I also want to talk about some stuff that I don't have slides for. One is something called roguing. And earlier we talked about varieties coming true. And that means that that plant resembles its parent closely. Roguing is a process that happens during the season where you remove plants from the breeding pool because they either have an issue, like, oh, 90% of my plants are doing well, but these 10%, are getting diseased or they're getting destroyed by insects or whatever. And those ones might want to come out of the breeding pool, which might mean that you just don't save seed from them, or you remove flowers from them, or you harvest them before seed saving happens. You might also find what's called an off-type plant. So if you're growing a red cherry tomato and you get 1 or 2 yellow ones, if you want to preserve that variety, you don't save seed from those yellow ones, or you might remove them as soon as you can see that they are off-type. How much you do brooding depends a lot on what you're trying to do with your seed saver. A moderate amount is generally your best bet because you want to remove off-type plants to keep that variety, within the idea of what you want. If it's a red cherry tomato, you want to keep it being a red cherry tomato. But you don't want to erode so many plants out that you narrow the gene pool too significantly, especially in consideration of climate change. So if you had, a big population of some crop this year and you rode really hard and only save seeds from the ones that thrive in this excessively wet year, you might wind up with pushing that variety into not being well adapted to drought. The genetics that thrive next year are not necessarily the genetics that thrive this year. So having a balance between keeping the plant, more or less in the same state it is, and preserving enough diversity so that you get good, at least some part of the population is going to do well in a wide variety of circumstances, because that's what we're going to get. We're going to get a more diverse climate in the coming years than we've had in the past. Does that make sense to everyone? I also wanted to mention about saving seeds from wild plants. Because most wild plants don't have these stable breeding varieties, it's typically much easier to save seeds because all you're looking at is species level for the most part. There can be exceptions to that. For instance, if you have some wild type sunflower, Tiarella portfolio, that's a plant where there are a bunch of hybrids and weird horticultural selections. So that might be something where, like, oh, well, I don't want to save seeds from this wild type one because it's right next to this horticultural hybrid, and I can get something weird there. But for the most part, wild plants are very easy to save. I also want to just touch on collecting seeds from wild populations. This is an area that requires a little bit of finesse. Collecting seeds from wild populations of plants is great in that it helps preserve and propagate these local ecotype genetics that are excellent to be spread around. But we also want to do that with a lot of consideration that we're not having a negative impact on that population's ability to reproduce. So if you're going to collect seeds from wild plants, I would recommend only doing that with populations that are stable and robust. So if there's like one individual of some unusual wildflower, probably don't harvest those seeds. And unless there's a very large population, only take a small amount of seed. I try to stay under 5 or 10% of the total seeds out there, which, even in a patch of plants this big, 5% of those seeds is tons. Also, you would want to take a little bit from a few different plants if you're collecting from wild plants, just to preserve, a little bit more of that potential genetic diversity. All right, so on to the actual mechanics of cleaning and saving seeds. So there's two basic different ways to clean and save seeds: wet process and dry process. Wet process is for any plant that when the fruit is ripe, it's juicy and wet. Tomato is kind of your most common example of this. If you're at all familiar with tomatoes, you probably know they're contained in a little bubble of gel. You need to get rid of that gel in order to make those seeds storable. And the way you do that is you cut the fruit in half, scoop out the seeds. For very small seeds, very small fruits like berries, you can just crush the whole thing. That goop or crushed fruit or whatever goes into a jar with some water and let it sit out and ferment for a few days. Sometimes it'll get moldy on top. You can skim that off and throw it away. Ideally, you want to cover it with some cloth or something to keep flies out, because that will just make it that much more gross. And after a couple of days, the seeds, especially the good ones, will sink to the bottom. And you'll get like a layer of scum on top. And to get them totally clean, what you do is you fill that up with water, wait a second for the seeds to sink down, and just pour off all the gross stuff, leaving the seeds at the bottom, and repeat as necessary until you've got clean water with seeds at the bottom. Then you can strain out the seeds and dry them. Some seeds do better if they're never dried. This is mostly for woody perennials. Any like normal vegetable seed, like tomatoes and cucumbers, are going to store best dry, so you can get those nice and dry. But if you're growing something, some weird berry found out in the woods, probably better to keep those damp and sow them as soon as possible and leave them outside to strengthify. And the reason for that is some of those seeds either die when they're fully dry, like an acorn, say, or a chestnut. If those get fully dry, they just straight up die. And a lot of them develop deep dormancy when fully dry, which means that they might take 5 to 10 years to germinate. But if you keep them damp, then hopefully they'll germinate after one winter. And again, that only applies to like mostly weird perennials. Any vegetable seed you want to dry, and they should germinate like immediately. The dry process is for any seed that grows like in a pod or in a seed head that dries on the plant. Ideally, you want to harvest these when they're dry on the plant. Sometimes that's not possible, especially in our very humid climate. Some stuff like beans especially tend to get moldy on the plant, in which case you want to let them go as long as possible and then pick them. You can pick like leathery beans and they should do fine. Anything that you're picking that's not quite dry, you want to be real careful about how you store it. Ideally, putting it on a screen inside in order to decent air circulation to let it finish drying. For stuff that is more or less totally dry on a plant, I like to harvest it on the driest way possible, and I put it straight into a paper bag. I leave the top of the bag open and store it until I get around to cleaning it, which usually happens in the fall. To clean seeds in the dry process, you want them to be really dry because it makes all the little parts really brittle and easy to smash up and separate the seeds from everything else. Once they're nice and dry, the next step is threshing, not threshing like it says on the slide, that's a typo. And threshing basically means smashing up the seed head to separate the seed from everything else. That everything else is called the chaff. And the process of separating is called winnowing. So the very, and I'll demonstrate all this stuff after, but just to go over it quickly now, the most simple form of threshing is just take the seeds in your hands, if they're pokey or sharp or whatever your was, and just go like this. And that's enough for most things. It's just really slow. So it's perfect if you have like this much seed, you can just rub it between your hands and that's fine for threshing. The next step up is called a bucket thresher. It's basically a miniature weed whacker head that you put in a 5-gallon bucket and drive with a drill. So you can fill that bucket up like half or 2/3 of the way with seed pods or seed heads, close up the lid, the bucket thresher comes through the lid, you drive it with a drill, and it does this just really fast and really well. In between those two methods is something called a box thresher, which is just an open top box. You can line it with vinyl stair tread to make it kind of rough and coarse. And then you can use a chunk of 2x4 also covered in vinyl to like rub the seeds across. And that's a nice sort of in-between way, especially if you've got stuff that's really like in a tough pod that you want to get out. Then we need to separate the seeds from everything else. And seeds tend to be more dense than the chaff, and you can use that to your advantage. Just pouring the mixture of seeds and chaff from a bowl to another container, doing that several times. When there's a breeze, the light chaff will blow away, and the heavier seeds will fall more straight down into the bowl. And you can also do this in front of a fan. And that's pretty good. If the seeds are very small and delicate, prone to blowing away, you can either just use screens to try and get out the seeds based on particle size, or you can put them in a bowl and gently blow across them instead of using a fan. And then if you're doing a lot of seeds, there's something called an open source seed cleaner that I'll demo later, but it uses basically a box with some baffles in it and a vacuum to be able to separate seeds from chaff very quickly and efficiently. Almost all seeds that you're going to be saving are orthodox seeds, and that means that they can survive being fully dried. And to properly store those seeds, you want them as dry as possible, and you want to put them in a cool, dark place that doesn't shift temperature quickly, and where they can remain dry. Basements are really good as long as the seeds are stored in airtight containers. So if you've got a bunch of seeds in paper packets, basement is not so great because it tends to be quite humid and damp. Closets are also pretty good. And if there's something you want to store for a really long time, the freezer is your best option. In order for seeds to store well in the freezer, they need to be extremely dry. So before freezing, you would want to seal them in a container with some silica gel. And then silica gel will absorb any excess moisture, get them really dry, then they go into an airtight container and can be frozen. Depending on the species, seeds stay viable for 1 to 2 years for really delicate seeds like parsnip or carrot, to 5 to 10 plus years for something like a squash, where it's got like a really thick seed coat on it. If they're carefully stored in the freezer, you can double, triple, maybe more those storage. So they can store quite a while. And then, of course, there are your occasional anomaly where seeds have been known to germinate after 10,000 years of storage. Question?
So I interrupt your flow too much here, but we get a lot of power outages here in Maine. And so if you've got things for the freezer, are they good to use the power?
Not necessarily.
Can they thaw?
It's
frozen?
Yeah, freeze cycles are bad, but not necessarily fatal. So if you've got some variety that you put in the freezer and you're planning on holding it there for like 5 years, and you know power goes out and it freezes or thaws and freezes back, maybe you want to try and grow that one out this year just so that you reduce the number of times that's going to happen. But it's not necessarily, it's suboptimal, but not necessarily going to screw up the whole thing. But good question. And for that reason, just normal storage where it's like you get it nice and dry and you stick it in the the closet that stays kind of cool. Probably your simplest option. All right, that is my last slide. In the handout, there's lots of resources. There's some books that if they don't have them in the library, you can definitely get on interlibrary loan. There is a link to a website that has basically all the same reference material as those books. Does anyone have any questions before I go set up the seed cleaning demo? Yes.
Usually, agricultural seed saving. And do these same principles apply to seed saving?
Yes. For the most part, perennial seed saving is somewhat easier because perennials are all, they're already kind of set up to complete their life cycle, where you might have to use a really heavy layer of mulch or like bring some biennials indoors to get them to survive over the winter. Perennials are already kind of completing their life cycle and setting seed. And for the most part, all you have to do is notice when the seed is ripe and pick it, collect it, and clean it.
This may be too specific a question, but just in terms of, I have bacteria, which doesn't like to be moved. And like it's absolutely enormous and it's forming pods as we speak. So is the same kind of idea that you dry the pods, or it says allow seeds to dry in the plant, where do I start with the pod? I mean, do I just take the pod off at any point, or do I wait until the absolute end of the season and start this process with the pods?
So it's just very easy to save. And basically, like the pod will go from green to black. Once it's black, it's pretty much dry. At that point, you can cut it and throw it in the bag until you get like a nice crisp day, and then clean it up and you're good to go.
Okay, thanks.
Question?
It looks to be self-pollinating.
Yes.
I can't remember the seed catalog. Are there hybrid beans?
Basically all beans are open pollinated, and we're lucky to have here in Maine one of North America's foremost seed savers, Will Hansel, who has thousands of varieties that he maintains, and he'll grow, because he's maintaining so many varieties, he'll grow, a row of variety A, a row of variety B. They're 2 feet from each other, and he says he gets almost no cross-pollination. So you can basically grow out any bean, save seed from them. Don't really need to worry about isolation at all.
I know you mentioned that, like I said, if seeds have been lost, and I know, in the past people would save, their like family tomato or family bean. Or I mean, are there certain varieties of plants that you would recommend sort of saving year to year to try and like bring that back? I mean, I know in Appalachia it's like every holler has their own type of bean, basically.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the history of that is in Maine. Are there certain things you think are worth sort of making a point of saving year to year to try and sort of develop their own style type?
Not necessarily. If you find something that's really rare, which you would mostly get by getting it directly from another seed saver rather than ordering from a catalog. So there's some organizations listed in the handout, like Seed Savers Exchange. If you get something really cool from Seed Savers Exchange that it's like, oh, well, this isn't available anywhere but Seed Savers Exchange, that would be a high priority. Another high priority is if you grow something random, and it does really well, then grow that again. And a cool thing about saving seeds that you may have implied, but I didn't specifically say, is home saved seeds tend to do better than commercial seeds. There's a few reasons for this. Probably the most important factor is when you're saving seeds, you're automatically selecting for what grows well with your agricultural practices in your soil. And so after a few generations of saving something, you might get consistently better results from saving it. So if you start off with something that did pretty good and then save seeds for a few generations, you might have something that is even better, even without making any crosses or like big selections. Another factor in home saved seeds doing better is something called seed grading. So large seed growers, when they clean up their seeds, they'll save the best quality stuff to replant. That's a good practice. However, what tends to happen, especially with large seed companies, is the next cut, like the best quality stuff stays with the grower for replanting. The next best quality stuff tends to go to large commercial growers, because they are the ones who know, like, oh, I need the best quality stuff because this is my livelihood. The very worst quality seeds are what gets turned into packet-sized stuff that you buy at the hardware store. That is like the bottom of the barrel crap. When you grow your own seeds, not only are you producing seeds that will, produce best in your conditions, but you're getting all of them. You'll be able to recognize pretty quickly, like, oh, these seeds are small and shriveled and not great, and these ones are really big and fat and shiny. I'm gonna plant these good ones and just like throw these in the compost. So when you're producing for yourself or your community, seeds get graded and treated in a different way, so you get better quality. That was kind of rambling, but did that more or less answer your question?
Yeah, but one other question.
Yep.
So I know we've talked a lot about like specific varieties, right? So like you might be saving seed because you want that true to type, very specific variety. Do you think it's worth saving seeds from like large genetic pools? I know like Frank Morton with Wild Garden Seed, he has all these varieties that are like incredibly diverse, and he's trying to like reintroduce sort of more genetic diversity, which means you're planting seeds and you're going to get like a lot of different types of kale or a lot of different types of, whatever it is. I mean, do you think there's a place for
Absolutely
growing non-true to type seed, but of a healthy variety?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. One example of that is I have started growing what I call a wide cross storage onion mix. And basically this project started when I'm not really trying to be like self-sufficient, but I do try and grow some of my own food. And so there are a few crops where my family is, we grow all of our own garlic. Usually we grow all of our own onions. And one year I had a particularly good onion year, and I had, 10 pounds of onions left when the next crop of onions was starting. And I was like, wow, look at this. Here's a few that are still perfect after like almost a whole year of storage. Those must be, really good genetically. So I'm gonna plant those, and I'm gonna ask my friends for the best of whatever onions they had left in May or whenever it was. And I wound up with like 7 or 8 varieties of onions. These are distinct, stable breeding varieties that I just planted all in the same bed and let them all cross. And now I'm into the F3 generation, and I'm getting significantly better and more vigorous onions than I've ever grown before, just by taking all these gene pools and just mixing them together. And I get some weird ones. I get some that are like this big, and I just eat those. Those are like the first ones to get eaten. And then I get some that are like big and beautiful and store a really long time. And I get interesting ranges of colors. There are some red ones, there are some yellow ones, there are some white ones. And now I'm seeing like mostly yellow, but some that are pink, or some that have like pink on the outside and white on the inside. And so while it is, I think, important and cool to maintain some of these heirloom varieties, I think it's also really fun to just throw everything in a bucket and mix it up and see what you get.
It's not seed saving, but garlic is interesting. Yeah, you save cloves and replant those. And you can, it doesn't take very long to get your own variety. Mine is, I breed them to get on 4 cloves.
Interesting.
Big cloves.
Yeah.
And this morning I used garlic in 2022.
Wow.
And I could plant it in another month, get a crop.
That's fascinating.
So garlic, you can save it, you can plant it the same year, but it doesn't take very many years of selection. Vigorous garlic, the way you like it.
Yeah. So this slide, we've got clonal cultivar. Potatoes and garlic are saved as clonal varieties. There's no genetic mixing really happening. And I had a friend of mine come to me and it's like, I can't wrap my head around this. My garlic has changed. I've been saving the same variety for 30 years. And it's changed significantly. How is that possible? Because I'm just saving the same variety over and over again, which is where you get into real interesting and complex stuff, where the genetics of your garlic almost certainly have not shifted significantly. But you have noticed that the expression of those genetics have changed in just a few years. And almost certainly what's happening is epigenetic change. So not change within the DNA structure of the plant, but additional changes that modify how the genome is presented. And that's another thing where one of the things that changes epigenetics a lot is stress. So if you've got a plant that you're growing in the same environment over and over again, it will change how it expresses its genome to sort of match that, if that makes sense. So even within clonal cultivars, where there's very little actual genetic drift, saving your own propagation material year to year often produces better results. Any questions? Cool. Well, I'm going to take a few minutes to set up. I think I'm going to be in the shade at that end of the building. Feel free to come by and check out my seed cleaning demo. And if you think of any more questions, I'm happy to answer whatever questions you got. And thanks for coming out.